Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador, and I'd like to introduce you to my PAL workflow. These are portrait, action and landscape groups of settings that I've registered to the camera's memories, and I can recall them simply by turning the shoot mode dial to 1, 2 or 3. Now this is a workflow to avoid missing a shot and ensure that you always have a high hit rate of successful images. Now I shoot a broad range of subject matters. I might be shooting portraits of animals or humans, action shots at sporting events or landscapes. And because I'm quickly changing between these groups of settings, it is a reliable workflow that ensures that I never miss a shot. And I can simply turn that shoot mode dial to 1, 2 or 3 to quickly recall those settings. So I'm starting from a known starting point. Now my portrait setting prioritizes shallow depth of field. It will freeze slow movement, and I'm prioritizing IAF in continuous autofocus. Now there's going to be at least 10 settings that I've registered to the portrait setting, and of course these are difficult to remember to recall if you've been shooting an entirely different genre just moments before. Now if you have been shooting say landscapes or action shots, you're going to have to make 2 dial adjustments, at least 4 custom key adjustments and 4 menu adjustments to set up the camera for shooting portraits with reliable success. And if I quickly change to action, then I'm quickly changing my priorities. Now I want to freeze fast action using fast shutter speeds. I want to be able to track that fast action, and I want a continuous shooting with a high drive mode setting, so I'm using maximum frames per second. Now again, those will require at least 10 settings, and most of those are different to shooting portraits. And again, if I quickly change to shooting a landscape, now my priorities change once again. Now I will start with trying to acquire deep focus. I will prioritize low ISO for maximum dynamic range. I'll ensure my steady shot is helping me out if I'm shooting handheld landscapes, and I'll always be moving the focus to the foreground to maximize depth of field. Now again, those are going to be a lot of settings. You're going to have to deep dive into the menus if you haven't registered these groups of settings to a memory. Now when you are registering the group of settings to the memory, you are going to be in the shooting mode of choice, either P, A, S or M. Now you only use the 1, 2 or 3 when you're actually recalling those settings. You'll then go into the memories and look for the camera set memory to assign them to either 1, 2 or 3 on the camera's menu. There is an additional M1, M2, M3 and M4, but these are saved to the memory card, and these are actually deleted if you format the card. So it's primarily the 1, 2 and 3 settings you're most interested in registering your groups of settings to. Once you press that center button in the control wheel, you'll get the confirmation that you've registered these groups of settings. Now you simply recall them by dialing in 1, 2, 3 on the shoot mode dial. Now these are just starting point settings. You can modify and fine tune your settings as you're working in this particular genre of photography. Now I will have everything at my fingertips. I very rarely go into the main menus of the camera, so I'm basically using the dials, the exposure compensation dial. I'll be using my custom buttons, and I also have access to the FN menu, which is the 12 menus that I've set up for either stills or shooting movies. Now if I'm shooting in stills and I want to quickly change the subject detection, I put in subject detection into the FN menu, so I don't have to deep dive into the main menus. I would simply press the FN button, usually with the camera at my eye, navigate using the multi-selector or the control wheel until I get to subject detection, and then I simply roll the either the control wheel if you're using an APS-C camera, or the front dial if you're using a full frame camera, and this will change from human to animal and animal to bird if your camera supports bird IF. Now if I want to go back to my default registered memory, I would simply turn the shoot mode dial away from 1 back to 1, so I'll go back to that initial starting point of known settings. One of the things that I should also point out is I can set up a camera such as the Alpha 7R4, Alpha 9.2, Alpha 1, Alpha 7.4 from a camera setting file copied to a memory card. Now some of the late model cameras such as the A7C don't allow this. Now if you do set up using one of my CamSet files, that will include all of the FN menus, the custom keys and dial settings, the My Menu settings, and all of the memories accessed from 1, 2 and 3. Now if you do have a late model camera such as the Alpha 7C or an APS-C camera or an older full frame camera, then I have tables of settings that you can manually set up your camera, and these are laid out in ebooks that I allow my patrons to download. So if you navigate to patreon.com/Mark and sign up, you can download a 400 or 500 page ebook which will guide you into how to set up the camera, and you've got access to those CamSet files if you've got a late model full frame camera. So there's the link, patreon.com/Mark, as well as the ebooks. I have active Q&A forums, member only seminars, and raw files of recent reviews for lenses or cameras that I've been doing, plus those CamSet files. Now if we come into the PAL workflow again, and I did say that we're prioritizing shallow depth of field, freezing slow movement, and we have IAF looking after us in continuous autofocus. The continuous autofocus allows either the subject to move or me to move, and I will freeze that slow movement with a slightly faster shutter speed. Now I also use the portrait setting for isolating anything in the environment. So we're looking at a group of settings that will create shallow depth of field. So I'll use this not just for human portraits but for isolating flowers in the broader environment. And of course as I move in close and I'm using my portrait setting, I will isolate anything through that shallow depth of field. Now I use aperture priority for my portrait memory, and I will use that in conjunction with ISO auto minimum shutter speed. Now I do have control over that minimum shutter speed so I don't get subject blur in low ambient light, but having ISO auto minimum shutter speed instead of say manual exposure mode with auto ISO does allow that shutter speed to float higher to protect exposure. For instance, I've got the minimum shutter speed set to 1/250th of a second, but because I'm using a very wide aperture prime in very bright ambient conditions, that shutter speed has floated up to 1/8000th of a second to protect my exposure. So this is a preferred workflow to using manual exposure with auto ISO. Now I will start with a zone focus area, because most of the time, even if I've got foreground subjects that are in front of my subject, so long as I can keep my primary target inside of that zone and I have IAF active, then I will get a very reliable hit rate. And I do work a lot of events with moving people, and I found this very successful. Having my zone focus area means that I'm not constantly chasing my subject around with a small spot. There's only 9 possible positions for that zone. So if I have an obstacle obscuring the left side of the camera and my subject is on the right side, I'll just move that zone just by one movement to the right, and again I will reliably get my subject in sharp focus. Let's revisit my preferred settings for shooting action. Now the default settings will be using a fast shutter speed. I'll be wanting to track the fast action, so I'll be using an AF tracking focus area, and I'll be using continuous shooting with a high drive mode. Now this is ideal for shooting birds in flight. Now again I'll be using either a zone or a wide focus area to pick up that bird, so even if it's on the edge of the frame as it's in flight, it will still reliably pick up that bird in flight. I'll only drop down to using a spot focus area if the bird is nestled in amongst branches in a tree. I'll also be prioritizing a sticky tracking sensitivity. So even when things wander in front of the camera in between me and the subject I'm tracking, the camera will still reliably track my target subject, as in this instance here where somebody has walked in front of the camera and the camera holds on to my subject. Even when it disappears completely, it will hold on to my subject for at least 1 or 2 frames to reacquire that as soon as it comes back into view. This is also excellent settings for field sports where you're tracking a particular player with the ball, not any other player that might get in the way. Now this doesn't stop me from fine-tuning the settings. For instance, if I'm at motorsports, I will just change my ISO auto minimum shutter speed down to maybe 1/250th or 1/500th of a second. Now I have prioritized or set up my ISO auto minimum shutter speed to a custom key so I can quickly access. And if the ambient light is bright, I might roll the aperture down from maybe an f4 or 5.6 setting down to f11 just so I can slow the shutter speed down so I get this movement drag behind my moving subject. Let's revisit the landscape settings where I'm prioritizing deep focus with a small aperture. I'm maintaining the optimum ISO for maximum dynamic range, and again I'm moving focus to the foreground to maximize my depth of field. Now my settings are set up for handheld landscapes because for 90%, 95% of the time my landscape photographs are shot handheld, so I am relying on the in-body image stabilization of the cameras. Now I find that at first and last light of day I can still handhold comfortably at 1/8, 1/50th or 1/30th of a second at f11 while still prioritizing a low ISO setting such as ISO 100. I will only move to tripods when attaching ND filters, maybe for extended shutter speeds. Now again, dropping a smaller focus point in the lower 1/3 quadrant of the frame allows me to focus on something in the foreground rather than having the focus snap to something in the distance. This does maximize depth of field when working at an aperture such as f11. You should never really consider this PAL workflow as a straitjacket to creativity, more as a way of quickly recalling groups of settings so you never miss a shot. To give you an example of this, here I am in Montana shooting this horse whisperer with his horse with some of the snowy mountains in the background. Now I'll instantly go into my number 1 setting on the shoot mode dial because I know this will prioritize getting good figure ground separation between my hero subject and the background. Now this would be the same setting I'd be using for a closer head and shoulders portrait, and also a setting that would be ideal for isolating detail within that subject, ideal when you're trying to build up a narrative story about the subject or character you're capturing. But of course, as that cowboy gets onto his horse and starts racing around, then quickly I'm just going to move my shoot mode dial to number 2, and that will ensure that I freeze the fast action. And so this is a reliable way of moving groups of settings. Now sometimes you have to be a little bit creative in your choice of 1, 2 or 3. Now I would typically choose number 3 to shoot a landscape, but in this particular instance there's high drama going on in the landscape with huge waves crashing into these rocks, and I don't want those waves to blur. I want to freeze the crashing waves, so I've switched from my 3 setting on landscape to number 2 settings. I might just roll the aperture down 1 or 2 stops just to ensure I also get the required depth of field. But again, this is a quick way of recalling groups of settings so I don't miss the shot. And this is another example where I've moved from shooting my landscape with number 3 to shooting landscape with my action settings. This is because I'm on the bullet train doing over 200 miles an hour and I want to freeze Mount Mount Fuji and the foreground traveling at this rapid speed. So sometimes you can be quite creative in your choice of starting point, whether it's 1, 2 or 3. There are 3 other memories that I will outline in the ebooks, and also I've registered to my CamSet files, and these are 3 additional memories called Recall Custom Hold memories. These are groups of 10 or 11 settings that you can quickly recall just for 1 or 2 shots by holding down a custom key. Okay, so these are great ways of, if you don't want to tune the shoot mode dial because you just want to grab one quick shot with a completely different group of settings, this is another way of improving your workflow. To give you an example, I'm shooting sports action at a triathlon event using my action settings on number 2, but this swimmer has come to a sudden standstill just to check his time and start removing his wetsuit. So I just hold down a custom key and recall my portrait settings. This is only going to be for 1 or 2 frames, so I don't need to shoot this at 20 frames a second. I just need to grab 1 or 2 shots with a slower shutter speed, lower ISO. Same again if I've been shooting a bird on the riverbank waiting to catch a fish, and I've been using my portrait settings to isolate the bird from the background and keep the ISO low. But if I know the bird is just about to make a dart into the water to catch the prey, then I'm going to hold down and recall my action settings so I can quickly blast off 2 or 3 or 4 or more frames at 1/2000th of a second, so I can capture the wings pin sharp. And again, this was an instance where I was shooting a landscape with 3, and I could hear a dog owner whistling to their dog running behind me. I quickly turned around and grabbed 2 or 3 frames of this Dalmatian in full flight. So this again is a way of enhancing your workflow using memories. Just to remind you, I do have all of these memories outlined. In fact, the entire custom setup of the camera is outlined and mapped in these 400 and 500 page ebooks that you can download by going to www.patreon.com/Mark Gaylor. Now on patreon.com I also have active Q&A forums, member only seminars. There's over 20 hours of movies to watch there, plus raw files that I make available for reviews of recent lenses that I've been reviewing or cameras I've been reviewing, plus those CamSet files for late model full frame cameras. So there's lots of things to be had by joining Patreon, and there are no contracts or commitments. You can just sign up for a single month, take what you need, watch what you need to watch, and then unsubscribe. Here's just an overview of some of the 20 hours of seminar topics I've covered, everything from post-production editing specials to resolution and noise to black and white seminars, so I should have you covered in your topic of interest there. Hopefully you're interested in finding more about this PAL workflow, so head over to patreon.com, download the ebook and CamSet, and get support and advice about working with this workflow. And you've also got access to that 2-hour extended video tutorial that will walk you step by step through using and implementing this workflow, so you rarely if ever miss a shot moving forward. I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador.